On Sunday, the 3rd of October, 1993, a group of armed helicopters lifted off from an American military base at Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. Aboard was a confident band of 140 hand-picked elite soldiers, Rangers and Delta Force operators, long regarded as the most effective and highly trained fighting troops America has ever produced. After a 3-minute flight into the heart of Mogadishu, the plan was to descend onto a targeted house and snatch 2 of the leading henchmen of Mohammed Farah Aidid, a ruthless Somali warlord who was seen as the main obstacle to peace in the country. They would bundle them into waiting ground vehicles and rush them back to the base. After a thorough interrogation, they would be taken to join other Somali warmongers, incarcerated in a prison on an island off the southern coast. The mission had been planned to the last detail. Nothing was left to chance, and it was estimated it would take no more than 1 hour. America, however, was shaken to the core when the true story emerged. It presented newly installed President Bill Clinton with his first major foreign policy crisis. Far from being a textbook operation, the kidnap attempt turned into a catastrophic blunder. US soldiers found themselves pinned down for 17 hours, fighting for their lives against a huge Somali mob. By the time the unit was finally rescued, 18 American soldiers had died, and more than 70 were badly injured.
We went to Somalia to keep people from starving to death. Now we are killing women and children because they're combatants. It's got to stop.
The United States went into Somalia on humanitarian grounds, but somewhere along the way, these objectives were lost, resulting in a confused American public and a bitterly resentful Somali people who came to regard the Americans as oppressors. Somalia is a barren, poverty-stricken country bordering Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa. It became independent in 1960, an amalgamation of British and Italian protectorates. In 1969, the democratically elected government was thrown out in a military coup, and Somalia found itself under the despotic rule of a dictator, President Mohammed Siad Barre. Barre immediately cracked down on freedom of speech and religion. The most basic human rights were denied, and opposition to his rule brutally crushed. But this did not stop armed resistance. Battle-hardened by war with neighboring Ethiopia, local warlords sprung up all over the country, and the subsequent fighting against Barre's troops gradually destroyed Somalia's fragile infrastructure. One of the most notorious warlords was Mohammed Farah Aidid, who was eventually captured by government forces and spent several years in prison. Barre was deposed in 1991, but by then his men had looted, pillaged and starved Somalia so badly that famine had set in and people began to die in great numbers. The outside world gradually became aware of the tragedy. The international media called for action to be taken to help the Somali people. Eventually, the United Nations set up an office in Mogadishu to monitor the worsening situation. Then it began supplying a limited amount of food aid. But the bloody street battles continued, with Aidid, now released from jail, at the forefront. Back at UN headquarters, the Secretary General, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, decided that direct intervention was the only way to stop even more people dying, either through civil war or by starvation. In March 1992, the UN mediated a ceasefire between Somalia's warring factions, who then agreed to allow a UN monitoring mission into the country to oversee arrangements for distributing aid. The warlords, including Aidid, even provided heavily armed escorts to make sure the aid got through. The food deliveries increased. In July, 50 unarmed UN military observers arrived in Mogadishu to ensure that the ceasefire was being properly observed. However, Somalia was on the brink of total anarchy. The warlords soon realized that the UN food was a vital commodity which could be used to strengthen their power. Their followers began to loot relief flights as they landed and hijack food convoys. This made it increasingly difficult for the UN aid workers to reach the starving people. It was obvious that more rigorous action was required, so the UN appealed to its members to provide proper military support for its humanitarian aid program. UN troops were sent to Somalia. But George Bush, with only a few weeks left as President of the United States, believed that America should also play its part. On the 9th of December 1992, a group of US Marines stepped ashore in Somalia, the first of a 25,000-strong force which would take control and restore law and order. The US mission was called Operation Restore Hope. The world's press covered the initial landings. A short time later, Bush visited Somalia himself to reassure the frightened people that they had not been forgotten by the outside world, and to encourage his troops. The president reassured the American people.
Been one or two people over there suggesting that maybe we have done something that we ought not to do, but when you see what you have seen and what I saw today, I'm absolutely convinced that we've done the right thing.
Bush's intention was that, once the situation had been stabilized, control would be handed back to the UN peacekeepers. He wanted the US forces home by the beginning of the following year. This would coincide with the end of his presidency and the inauguration of Bill Clinton in January 1993. Bush intended to step down with the situation in Somalia well under control. Bill Clinton wanted the same. He did not want Somalia to blight the start of his presidency. Things didn't work out as planned. Unrest continued, and US troops were still in Somalia when President Clinton assumed office in January 1993. The presence of US attack helicopters overhead became part of daily life in Mogadishu. Eventually, in early May, Clinton handed military control back to the UN. But the warlord Aidid was still firmly in place, a major thorn in the peacekeepers' side. It was becoming obvious that something had to be done about him, or peace would never be restored. But while UN troops began to replace the Americans on the streets of Mogadishu, they were still reliant on US firepower to support them. By the beginning of June, the US presence had been reduced to just 1,200 combat soldiers and 3,000 support troops, but they still had to deal with Aidid and his followers. On the 5th of June, Aidid's men committed a terrible atrocity. They ambushed and killed 24 UN Pakistani soldiers while they were inspecting a Somali arms site. Some of the corpses were said to have been skinned. The UN peacekeepers and the remaining US troops were appalled. Led by the US command in Somalia, they immediately launched an extensive manhunt for Aidid. They even offered a $25,000 reward for his capture, a fortune in such a poverty-stricken country. The search was long, hard, and completely fruitless. Dozens of US and UN personnel were killed, and thousands of Somali rebels died. But none of this seemed to matter. The Americans had become obsessed with Aidid. Catching him, dead or alive, had become the #1 priority. This led the Americans to commit their first major blunder. On the 12th of July, helicopters attacked a house in the center of Mogadishu, where they mistakenly thought Aidid was hiding. The missiles killed a group of Aidid's clansmen who were actually trying to work out a peace deal with the UN. This had devastating consequences. 4 Western journalists who went to investigate were set upon by an angry mob and beaten to death. Aidid was furious at the assault on his fellow clansmen and declared all-out war on America. Many ordinary Somalis, disgusted by his killing of often innocent people, were equally angry. Undeterred, Task Force Ranger, as the search team was called, continued the hunt. They attacked and searched various other locations which they thought might contain Aidid or some of his men, with no luck. Then came the news they'd been waiting for. Intelligence informed them that 2 of Aidid's most trusted lieutenants were holed up in a house near a hotel in Mogadishu's busy central district. Too good a chance to miss, and Major General William F. Garrison, the Task Force Ranger commander, was determined to take it. At 3:40 p.m. on the afternoon of Sunday, the 3rd of October, 8 MH-60 Black Hawks and 8 Little Bird helicopters lifted off and headed for the center of Mogadishu. The plan was to land close to the target house, seize Aidid's men, and then bundle them into vehicles brought in by a supporting ground force. The helicopters duly arrived over the objective and put down suppressive fire. The Rangers abseiled to the ground, using flash grenades to distract possible opposition. To the surprise of the helicopter crews hovering above, thousands of Somalis, many of them armed, then poured into the area, and the astonished troops found themselves completely surrounded. The mob was eager to spill hated American blood. Even women and children joined in. Meanwhile, Aidid and his men were concentrating on bringing a helicopter down with rocket-propelled grenades. One of the Black Hawks, Super 6-1, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Cliff Walcott, a veteran of the 1991 Gulf War, suddenly noticed some Somalis aiming a grenade at his helicopter. He quickly turned broadside to give his gunners a clear line of fire. The next moment, to the horror of the troops on the ground, he was shot down. Some of the Rangers made their way to the crash site to find a horde of Somalis raking the wrecked helicopter with AK-47 assault rifles and grenades. The troops drove them back time and time again, but they kept on coming, and soon the area was littered with the dead and dying. It was becoming a bloodbath. Aidid's forces realized that they were on the verge of inflicting an embarrassing defeat on the world's most powerful nation. The downed Black Hawk was their principal trophy. Meanwhile, the ground force was desperately trying to get through to rescue the Rangers, but it had to turn back because of repeated ambushes. The situation looked grim. US vehicles were destroyed, and casualties began to mount as further reinforcements moved towards the battle zone. Bodies of dead US troops were soon caught on television cameras. The blunder was turning into a nightmare. Losing a Black Hawk was a disaster the Americans were completely unprepared for. But then the unthinkable happened again. Black Hawk Super 6-4, with Chief Warrant Officer Mike Durant at the controls, was also brought down by a grenade. Durant was then seized by the angry mob and dragged away to what he thought was certain death. By this time, the men around the first downed Black Hawk had taken over various vantage points from where they were better able to defend themselves. Many of them were convinced they'd never get out alive. The odds were overwhelming as the Somalis continued to blast them. It was just before dawn when the relief column, itself under heavy fire, eventually made its way through to rescue the battered and desperate men. They found them by using spotter helicopters. The surviving Rangers were huddled together in a darkened warren of badly damaged buildings and courtyards. The task force had managed to hold the enemy off for 17 hours. Most of them thought they'd never see the light of day again. Once the shaken survivors were safely on board, the relief column set off on a dramatic dash through the still dangerous streets. The convoy was massive, a crushing 2-mile-long force of more than 100 armored personnel carriers, tanks, Humvees, trucks and jeeps. It punched its way through a series of Somali ambushes and roadblocks, returning fire for fire as it continually came under attack. The convoy was headed for a disused sports stadium at the north end of the city. Here a team of paramedics had set up an emergency field hospital to provide instant care for the wounded. Once they had safely arrived at the stadium, a relay of helicopters flew in and out, taking the soldiers back to the airport base for further treatment. Black Hawk pilot Durant was released 11 days later, after President Clinton demanded his freedom. By now, Clinton had had enough. The specter of American corpses being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu had been the last straw. He ordered his troops home. Heads had to roll for this dreadful blunder. U.S. Defense Secretary Les Aspin resigned.
It's time for me to take a break and undertake a new kind of work.
Major General Garrison's career was also effectively finished. On the 25th of March 1994, the last US forces were pulled out of Somalia. They were followed by the UN, which was impotent without the backing of American firepower. The blunder at Mogadishu had proved fatal to the peacekeeping mission, and Somalia was abandoned to its fate. Aidid, the cause of America's embarrassment, held sway for another 3 years before he died of gunshot wounds. George Bush had wanted to end his presidency with a foreign affairs triumph. He believed that this would confirm America's role as international policeman in the new world order. He had launched his new international policy with the Gulf War against Iraq, but Somalia was a very different scenario. The US military command in that country had been allowed to concentrate on the eradication of the warlords at the expense of all else. Consequently, the Somali people had turned against both the US and the UN, whose troops had been sent to help them. Since the disasters in Mogadishu, US foreign policymakers have been much more cautious. American troops have subsequently been deployed in a similar role to troubled Kosovo in the Balkans, but their operations have been tightly restricted to peacekeeping and humanitarian aid. The blunders in Somalia in 1993 had a lasting impact.
Coming up in a moment on the History Channel, we've another military blunder.